Welcome to Mode Bespoke. I'm Atenas. For today's project, we're going to be working on a Tunisian crochet raglan. So let's get started. So here's a look at today's project. We're going to be working on just the yoke part today. In the next tutorial, we'll be working on the sleeves and the rest of the sweater. This is Tunisian crochet, so you will need a Tunisian crochet hook. So you'll be able to make this raglan in any size for adults, newborns, any size. And it is going to be an open front raglan. I will make another tutorial where I show you how to do one that is just a continuous worked in the round, so you don't have to have any buttons. But for today, we're going to learn to do this one right here that has the buttons in the front. So let's talk about our supplies real quick. Like I mentioned before, you will need a Tunisian crochet hook. I'm going to be using these KnitPal hooks, and these are bamboo hooks. And now, as far as your yarn goes, you can pick any yarn you want. Just make sure that you read the yarn size and check out the recommended hook size. So for a bulky yarn like this one, you would need a 9mm hook, or you can use a lighter yarn like this one. You would need a 3.5 to 4.5. So whichever yarn you use, make sure you check the label so you know what size hook you need. Now you're also going to need a measuring tape. Now yours can either be in centimeters and inches. I happen to work in inches. And you're going to need 4 stitch markers. Now you can use safety pins if you prefer, or even bobby pins if you don't have any of these. But you're going to need 4 of these. It's going to make the transitions for the seam a lot easier to identify if you have them. So let's take a look at the yoke right here. This one does curl up. This is Tunisian crochet, and we are going to be using a knit stitch. The knit stitch has a tendency to curl up, but let's open it up here so you can take a look at the stitching. So this is mostly all knit stitch. We are going to need to use a Tunisian simple stitch, and that's just going to be for the seam stitching right over here. But other than that, the rest of it is quite simple. It's all knit stitch. This is going to be the first of many raglan patterns that I'm going to post on the channel. Some of them are going to have slightly different designs, but for the first few, we're going to work with just knit stitch, just so we get comfortable creating the raglan and the yoke part of it. We're going to need 2 measurements in order to create this. The first one is the circumference of your head. So whether this is a pattern for a newborn, or if it is for you or your parent or whoever you're making this for, make sure you get their head circumference. You're also going to need the back measurement. So this is from under one armpit to the other armpit. If you don't have any of these measurements, don't worry about it. I have them up on the blog. I've got a chart on there. You can go check it out. I'll have them in both inches and in centimeters, so you'll be able to find whichever unit of measurement you use. But I'll have both of them there, and they're going to be by age group. So go check those out. I'll leave a link in the description box below. I'm going to be making one that's for a 6-month-old baby. So let me show you where we're going to take our back measurement here. We're going to work with one side. So you'll see more about this here in just a minute, but that's going to be the back measurement, just so you know what part of the raglan I'm referring to when you see that measurement. So again, 2 measurements, head circumference, and then the back, both available on the blog. So for today's example, I'm going to be crocheting one for a 6-month-old baby. That is going to be a head circumference of 16 inches or 41 centimeters, and I'm going to need to make a chain of 46 stitches. Now please keep in mind that those 46 stitches are for the size yarn I am using. I'm using a size 4 medium worsted yarn, and I'm using a 5.5mm hook. I'm going to teach you how to calculate your stitch count so that you can use any yarn size you want, whether it's a fingering yarn, sport yarn, or any size hook. So we're going to begin by making a chain. So you're going to wrap the yarn around 2 fingers. You're going to grab your hook and insert it through the front loop, so this first one right here. We're going to grab the yarn right behind it, pull it through our loop, and you remove your fingers and pull on the threads right below to create a slip knot. So we're just going to make a regular chain, nothing special about it. We're going to begin by wrapping the yarn around our hook. So yarn over, we're going to pull that top loop through the bottom loop, and then we have one chain. So let's do this again. Yarn over, pull the top loop through the bottom, yarn over, pull through for 3, 4, and 5. So I'm going to stop right here. Now, the number of chains that you need depends on a couple of different factors, mostly the yarn size and your hook size. That's why you need a tape measure. So crochet a length of chains and measure it as you go. So I need this to measure 16 inches in length. You need to count your chains as you are making them, so that you have to have that stitch count because we're going to use it for some math later. So right now I think I've crocheted 5 stitches. Okay, so I'm going to continue to chain, counting my stitches as I go until I have a length that's approximately 16 inches. So here I've made a length of chain already. Now I'm going to go through and measure it, see if it's the 16 inches I need. And I'm at about 12, so I'm a bit short. So I'm going to need to crochet a few more stitches. So I know I need a total of 46 because I've made this sweater before using this yarn. So I need to chain 46 stitches. It might be different for you. I know I think it was like 72 stitches when I was working with a fingering yarn. But again, that number is going to change depending on what size hook you're using and what size yarn you are using. So make sure you are counting your stitches as you go and you are measuring as you go. Okay, so let's math. Now, I said we needed 46 stitches, at least I did for this size. I'm going to add 15 extra stitches. That is going to give me a total of 61 stitches. Now, if you're wondering where those 15 extra stitches came from, here we go. So here's the list of extra chains, and this is for any yarn weight that you are using. So you're going to add 15 chain to any children's or baby sizes. You're going to add 25 chains for adult sizes or 35 chains for adult extra large XL sizes. Let's go back to our math. So we're going to take those 61 stitches, which was at 46 plus 15, and then we're going to divide that by 5. That's going to give us 12.2. Round to the nearest even number. In this case, it is going to be 12. So where does that 5 come from? That's because we have 5 different parts to this raglan. We have 2 parts, which is 1 for each sleeve, 2 parts for the front because we have the 2 flaps, and 1 part for the back. So once we've divided the 61 by 5, we get a stitch count of 12, and this is for the sleeves. So each sleeve will be a chain of 12. So now to get the measurement for the back and the front, we're going to divide that 61 by 2. That gives us 30.5. We want a whole number that is even, so we're going to round down to 30. That 2 comes from the 2 parts, so we have the back and the front. Those are going to be typically the same size. So now we're going to take that 30 and we're going to subtract the sleeve count, which was 12. So 30 minus 12 gives us 18. This means the stitch count for the back of our raglan is 18 stitches. And because we're making this as a cardigan that opens in the front, we have to divide 18 by 2, which will give you 9. That means each of the flaps of the front of our cardigan is going to be made up of 9 stitches. Then we'll have the same total for the front part of the sweater as the back part of the sweater. So make sure you've written down these stitch counts for the sleeve, the back, and the front, and we're going to use those while we are constructing our sweater. So here's a little note on the construction of our sweater. So like I said, this one's going to be a cardigan with the front opening. So we're going to need 9 stitches right here in the front. We're going to need 12 stitches for the sleeve. Now let me pop this open. So this is what the raglan is going to look like at the top part right here. So here's our yoke. So there's 9 for the front, 12 for the sleeve, 18 for the back, 12 for the other sleeve, and then 9 to finish the front. Keep in mind that if you are making this raglan for a different size, that is anything other than a 6-month-old baby, your stitch counts might be different. Just remember to write them down and you'll be just fine. So let's actually begin to crochet this thing. So we're going to make that chain that we had already calculated. So I had already calculated that I needed a chain of 46 stitches. So we're going to begin again. So I'm going to begin with my chain of 9 because we're beginning with the front panel. So we've got 1, 2, 3, so forth until we get to 9. When you get to 9, we're going to need a stitch marker. So we're going to place our stitch marker right here, and this is the stitch that is on the hook. Place it towards the back. It'll make it a lot easier later on. I don't know if it makes a difference or not, but in my head it worked out. So now we have to crochet the chain count for the sleeve. Now our stitch count was 12. So that means I need to crochet a chain of 12 for that sleeve section. So we begin again here with 1 and 2, 3, 4, and so forth until we get to 12 stitches. Once we get to our 12th stitch, we're going to place another stitch marker, and that's just on the stitch right here that's on the hook. There we go. Oh, not quite. All right. Now we have to make the stitches for the back, so that is 18 stitches. So we go and 18. All right. Once we've got those, we're going to place another stitch marker. All right, and now we just have to finish the rest of the stitch count. So we need 12 for the other sleeve. So right now we've got the front, the sleeve, the back. So let me show you here on this sweater. So we are here. So we've just chained this one, which is 9, 12, 18, and then we're here. So continue crocheting the remaining stitches. So you need 12 and then stitch marker and then 9. So I'll let you finish that, and then we'll continue with our foundation row. So here's my chain already completed, and I've got the back, the sleeve, and the front. So when we put it, here, let's shape it so that it, let me get my hook out of the way. Let's shape it so it makes a little bit more sense, and it just kind of gets the shape of the raglan we're going to make. So here are sleeves. This is the front part of the sweater. This is kind of what it's going to look like. We're going to build onto this from here. So let's begin with our foundation row. Now, in the foundation row, that one's going to be just your standard cast on for most Tunisian projects. So we're going to skip the very first chain because we've already got that looped on our hook. We're going to go into that second chain right here. So the second stitch from your hook, insert your hook, yarn over, and pull up a loop. So quite simple. Let's do another one. We're going to insert our hook into the stitch, yarn over, pull up a loop, and you're just going to repeat that in every stitch of the chain. So when you get to your stitch markers, don't worry, you don't need to do anything different. You just cast on like you normally would. So you're going to cast on for every stitch, and I will see you at the end of the row so we can work a return pass. So I've cast on all of my stitches. This is what my hook looks like right now. For a return pass, it's just your standard return pass, just the regular one. We're going to yarn over and pull through one loop, so this top loop on our hook. Now for the rest of the stitches in the row, we're going to yarn over and pull through 2. So we're going to pull through these top 2 loops. So there's 1, 2. Yarn over, pull through 2. So 1, 2, and yarn over, pull through 1, 2, yarn over, pull through 1, 2. You're going to repeat this until you are left with just one loop on your hook. So once you've completed your return pass, your foundation row should look like this. Now, we're going to begin the first row of our Tunisian work, and now we're going to have to work some increases. So, we're going to need to pay attention to our stitch markers, and we're going to do an increase on each side of the stitch marker because what we want to do is make this part of our sweater wider. So, we're going to create this stitching right here. This is just one of many different types of stitching you can use, but what we're doing with the increases is we're widening up the sweater, and then this is just the body of the sweater as well as the sleeves. This is all going to be pretty even, so that's why the only number you need to know is the width of the sweater, at least for this particular raglan pattern. They are different, so each pattern has just kind of its own different measurements, so pay attention to those when you're working with anyone else's pattern. However, this is just a very basic raglan, so all you need to pay attention to from here on out is going to be the width of our sweater. So let's start working on these increases. I'll show you how it goes. This first row is going to be a little bit different than all of our other rows from here on out. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start casting on knit stitches. Skip the first vertical stitch. You already have it on your hook. We're going to go into the second one. Remember that our stitch is made up of 2 loops or 2 legs. It's got the back one and the front one. We're going to insert our hook right between both of them all the way through the back of the fabric, yarn over, and cast on 1. So we're going to go into the next stitch, and we're going to also crochet a knit stitch. So here is the back loop, front loop, or leg, whatever you call it. We're going to insert our hook in between them, go towards the back, yarn over, and pull up a loop. So just cast on a knit stitch until you get to the stitch marker. So we're going to stop at the stitch right before our stitch marker because this is where we're going to begin the increases. So I'm just going to work a knit stitch in each of the stitches right here. We are almost, yeah, here we are, we've got there. So we made it to the stitch right before our stitch marker. So this is how our increases are going to work. So you're going to use this vertical stitch in front and then the vertical stitch following your stitch marker. There's going to be an increase on both of these stitches, as well as one added stitch in between these vertical stitches. So separate your stitching so you can see both legs. So you've got this back loop right over here. We're going to crochet that as a Tunisian simple stitch. So insert your hook behind the loop or behind the leg and go all the way through like this. Next, you're going to yarn over and you're going to pull up a loop. So cast on one. Now, we're going to need to crochet a knit stitch, and that's going to be right between this loop or this leg that we just crocheted into and the one right next to it. So right between both of those loops, just like you would any other knit stitch. So you're going to insert your hook towards the back and you're going to yarn over and pull up a loop. And now, that was just the first increase. Now we need to add a stitch. We're going to add this stitch in this chain space between the two vertical stitches. You're just going to insert your hook into the space, yarn over, and pull up a loop. And that's it. Now, our second increase is going to go in the vertical stitch right after the stitch marker. So the one right next to it, right after. We're going to repeat what we just did. So we're going to insert our hook behind that back loop or the back leg. So we're going to Tunisian simple stitch into this loop. So we're just going to grab this right here. So it looks like this. We're going to yarn over and pull up a loop. So cast on one. Now we're going to knit stitch. So you're going to need to insert the hook between the two loops that make up the stitch. So right in here, we're going to insert the hook, yarn over, and pull up a loop. And there you go. So that was the increase you need. Now, for the rest of these stitches, up until you get to your next stitch marker, you're going to work a knit stitch in every one of those. So in each of the vertical stitches, you're going to stop at the vertical stitch right before the stitch marker. So continuing on, we're going to knit stitch here and here and here and into all of these stitches. I don't have a lot of stitches left, so I'm just going to leave the camera rolling. Okay, so we're here. We've arrived. So just to show our example again, we are going to be repeating this same increase sequence so that each of the seams of the raglan looks the same. So we're going to do the Tunisian simple stitch, knit stitch, and then add a stitch. And then again, simple stitch, knit stitch. This will give us this particular look. So going back to our work, we're going to work our increases again. Now remember that we're going to work one increase into each of these vertical stitches. So it's the vertical stitch right before your stitch marker and right after your stitch marker. Each of these gets an increase, and you're going to add a stitch in between each of those vertical stitches. So we're going to Tunisian simple stitch into the back loop or the back leg of the first vertical stitch. So insert your hook behind the post or behind the stitch, the leg, whatever you want to call it, yarn over and pull up one. And then you're going to knit stitch into that same vertical stitch. So right between the two loops or the two legs, you're going to insert your hook, yarn over, and pull up a loop. So we're going to cast on a knit stitch. Now we're just going to cast on one stitch in between the vertical stitches. So in this chain space, you're just going to insert your hook into the chain space, yarn over, and cast on one loop. So this is just going to add one extra stitch. You're only going to do that, you're only going to do this for this first row. Alright, now we're going to repeat this increase here in the next vertical stitch. So we're going to Tunisian simple stitch in this back loop or back leg. And then we knit stitch in this same vertical stitch. And there we go. Now for the rest of the work, you're going to knit stitch and then you're going to repeat your increases in your remaining two stitch markers. So I'll let you complete that. And once you get to the end of the row, it should look a little like this. This is going to be the final stitch of the row. So this one right here. we have to cast on into that one as well. And what I like to do is just insert my hook behind these two threads right here along the side. So I just insert my hook like this, yarn over, and pull up one. It's going to give me a nice and clean edge. Now, you work a regular return pass, so yarn over, pull through one, and then yarn over, pull through two until you are left with just one loop on your hook. Once you've completed your return pass, your work should look a little like this. Now, if I try to straighten this out, you are going to notice that my fabric is turning wavy. And that is because we have added increases to these little pointy bits. So we've added stitches here, 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 and here. Now keep in mind that this first row, we have added 3 stitches in each of our increases. From here on out, you will only be adding 2 stitches per increase. So this first row, we added 3 stitches right here, 3, 3, 3. In the next row, so from row 2 throughout the rest of the pattern for this raglan, you're going to add 2. So it'll be 2, 2, 2, 2. Okay? So now let's begin with row number 2. So when you get to these stitches right here to the stitch marker, you're going to look for this long stitch. So this one is right above your stitch marker. That is where you're going, that's the centermost stitch. So let's begin here again on the second vertical stitch of the row. So we'll just begin with our knit stitches, and I'll show you what we're going to do when we get to that stitch marker. But stop at the stitch right before you get to the stitch marker. So let me get a little more yarn here. And we are almost there. I've got another stitch left, I think. Let me take a look. Okay, yes. So here is this long stitch, and it's directly above my stitch marker, which means my increase is going to be in the stitch right before that. So this vertical stitch. So the center one is just going to be a knit stitch, and this is the stitch you added in that chain space. So let's go into this stitch right before the stitch marker. We're going to do our increase. So we are going to Tunisian simple stitch into that back loop or the back leg. So here it is. Yarn over, and you're going to pull up 1. So just pull up a loop. So we've cast on 1. You're going to knit stitch in that same vertical stitch. And now in this center stitch, so this is the one that we did in, or the one that we added in our chain space, we are going to knit stitch into this center one. So you're going to do this from here on out in every row. The center one gets a knit stitch. So no increase in that stitch. And then you're going to increase in the stitch following the knit stitch. So just like we did before, you're going to Tunisian simple stitch into the back loop or the back leg. And then you're going to knit stitch into that same vertical stitch. So Tunisian simple stitch and then knit stitch. Okay, so there's our increase. So now we've increased 2 stitches, one right before where our stitch marker is, and then one after the stitch marker. Now, we're going to continue to just knit stitch just 1 for every vertical stitch until we get to the next stitch marker. At the next stitch marker, we're going to repeat this whole process again. So let me work up these stitches. I don't have very many left. And we should be here in about another stitch or 2. Yeah. All right, so here we go. Let's get some more yarn. So let's take a look here. So we've got the long stitch. Oh, but I lost a stitch off my hook. Hold on, let's fix this. Okay, there we go. So here is this long vertical stitch, and it's directly above my stitch marker. That's going to be our knit stitch. The one right before that is our increase. The one after that is our increase. So beginning on this first increase, we are going to Tunisian simple stitch into the back loop. And then you're going to knit stitch into that same vertical stitch. We're going to knit stitch in the following stitch, so the one that's right above our stitch marker. That's going to be the center stitch. So here we go, we knit 1. And then we're going to Tunisian simple stitch into the next vertical post, so using the back loop. And then you're going to knit stitch right in that same vertical stitch. And that's it. You're going to work the remaining 2 increases the exact same way. So continue the row, and then we can work on the return pass. So here we are at that final stitch of the row. We've cast everything on, and now we work a return pass, and that is yarn over, pull through 1, and then for the rest of the stitches it is yarn over, pull through 2 until you are left with just 1 loop on your hook. So a quick note here, because I was crocheting along, and something I get asked a lot about when I'm working with Tunisian crochet has to do with the curl. Now with a knit stitch you are going to get a curl. See, you can already see that it is starting to curl up. This is completely normal. This is Tunisian crochet. Not all Tunisian crochet stitches curl up, but the knit stitch is one of those curl up stitches. So here's another yoke that I'm working on for the same sweater, but it's just using a different yarn. And as you can see, it has got a bit of a curl going on. It's totally normal. You will get rid of it. Don't worry, we'll get rid of it as we add on to our sweater. So when you add the collar, when you add the sleeves, when you add the elastic at the end, and then just like all of this trim and stuff, you will completely get rid of the curl. So you're not going to need to, oh gosh, what is it called? I just spaced the name. Block it. That's what it is. You're not going to need to block your work. So don't worry about it. Just keep working on this. Work through the curl. It's going to be okay. Once you have completed this row, your work is going to look like this. So now it lays a lot more square. So your fabric is starting to take shape. This is what it should look like by the end of row 2. Now from row 3 on out, it is just going to increase in size. So the shape of this is not going to change anymore as far as, it's going to be a square from here on out. Your increases, we're going to work them the exact same way. They may be a little more difficult to see in the 3rd row. From the 4th row on, it'll be easier. But if you would like to move your stitch marker, look for the stitch that's right above the stitch marker, so directly above it. Now, if you pay attention here, you're going to see that this ends at a bit of a point. So you've got a flat area, and then you've got 2 points. So there's a point on this side and a point on the other side. You're going to move your stitch marker to the stitch in the middle of the flat side. So that might be a little bit easier for some folks to see. Otherwise, just follow your stitch marker all the way up, and that's where you're going to place it so that you know where the knit stitch is going to be, the one that's right between the 2 increases. So just try doing this before the beginning of your 3rd row, and then from your 4th row on, you might not need to move your stitch marker anymore. So here, let's look again on this other point. So I'm just going to remove my stitch marker. I'm going to lay my work flat here, and then as you can see, there's a point here and a point here. I'm going to place my stitch marker in the center stitch, so the one right in the middle of that flat space in between the 2 points. Repeat this with your remaining 2 stitch markers, and you're ready to begin row number 3. So we're just going to do this first increase together. From here on out, I think you should be able to work your stitch or your increases, just fine without me. Alright, so we skip the first vertical stitch, and then we knit stitch all the way until we get to our stitch marker. Remember that you have to stop one vertical stitch before the stitch marker. So I've got here, this one right here. Here's my stitch marker. We're going to increase in the stitch right before it. So we begin with a Tunisian simple stitch right in here. That is using the back loop or the back leg of the stitch. We're going to knit stitch into the vertical stitch, so that same one that we just worked into. We're going to knit stitch into the stitch with a stitch marker. So here it is, that centermost stitch. We knit stitch, and then we increase in the vertical stitch right after that. So that is made up of a Tunisian simple stitch, that is a back loop simple Tunisian simple stitch or back leg. So there we go. And then you knit stitch in that same vertical stitch. And that's it. Continue to work the rest of the pattern this way. You're going to start adding some width to the back and the front part of your sweater, as well as the sleeves, of course, but we're going to need to measure the back side, so that's going to be the important thing to look out for. So complete the rest of your rows. This is what the seam is going to start to look like. Keep in mind that it will look a little bit different depending on what yarn you are working with. Some yarns, the this seam is a lot more visible than with other yarns. So yarns that have a sheen, you might be able to notice the seam a little bit better, but for all of them, you'll be able to see the change in direction of our stitching. So it'll be a nice seam no matter what yarn you use. Now, as you add rows to your raglan, you're going to notice that this is all going to start widening up. Use the back side of your sweater and you need to measure the width. So from this part of the seam to the other part, so let's just take our measuring tape, and as you add rows, just go through and check it because you'd be surprised how much width 1 or 2 rows adds. So check maybe out every other row, measure it through. This sweater is for an 18-month-old, so I needed the width to be 13 inches, which as you can see, here it is. Now, after you've completed whatever measurement you need, that's where you're going to stop. So in the next tutorial, I'll show you how to do the sleeves and then the bottom part of our sweater, so the trunk part of the sweater. That requires a little bit more work. We're going to do some decreases, and you also will learn how to work the trim, but that's going to be for next week's tutorial. Now, in the coming weeks, so the weeks after this, we're also going to learn to make a raglan in the round. I know a lot of you like to work in the round and you don't want to have any seams and you don't want to have a front opening or anything like that. We are going to learn to do that. This also will apply to the sleeves because these sleeves have decreases and you will have to sew them. This is a very basic raglan pattern, but for those of you that are a little bit more advanced and want to work in the round, keep an eye out for that tutorial. It is in the works. You will, however, need to purchase a double-ended hook. So if you want to join me for that tutorial, start shopping for double-ended hooks. If you want a place to start, look in the description box below. I do have a link to the double-sided hooks that I use for this, so go check that out. Alright, so once you have completed several rows for your raglan, this is what it should look like. And yes, it is quite curled. So we're going to measure this out. Let's just pull this out right here. Let's grab our measuring tape. I need the back measurement to be 9 inches. So I'm going to measure from the seam to this other one. This is on the back part of the sweater. So let's lay this flat and measure across, and I have 9 inches, just what I needed for a 6-month-old raglan or a 6-month-old baby's sweater. Make sure you get the measurement that you need for your size, and once you are done, that's it. Do not cut the yarn. We are going to be adding to this sweater in the next video, so don't cut the yarn, leave it like this, unless you're going to switch color or something, but leave it, put a stitch marker on it, and then we're going to pick this up here in the next few days. But there you go, guys. This is how you make a very basic, very easy raglan yoke for Tunisian crochet. We will be adding on to this, and there is going to be more raglan patterns here in the future, as we have begun the raglan segment of our video tutorial for the year. So keep an eye out for all of those videos. If you have any suggestions or anything you'd like to see, just leave it down in the comment section below. Follow me on Instagram. I'm at mode.bespoke. If you would like to see the measurement, the sizing charts, all of that, notes for this pattern, you can go to modebespoke.com. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, hit the subscribe button, and I will see you all again in the next video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.